NPSI. Thank you. Um, I'm an NPSI community member, but I'm also co-chair of the Continuing Education Committee. And on behalf of my co-chairs, Nancy Winters and Karen Harang, we wanted to welcome you to the first scientific meeting of this academic year. For this year, 2023-24 series, we're continuing with the theme of body as psychoanalytic object, which was the theme of, if you remember, the 2018 EBOR conference, which then became a book that Nancy and Karen and I co-edited and was published by Routledge in 2021. There's a lot of interest in the topic, and we were so gratified to win the 2023 Gradiva Award for Best Edited Book. And also there was a lot of attendance and a lot of interest in last year's scientific meeting. So Nancy and Karen and I wanted to continue the momentum of the theme on the topic of the body, where we invited some of our book chapters last season, authors, as well as other scholars that presented on this theme. And it goes without saying, I hope that there's a rapidly growing interest in the wider world of psychoanalysis regarding the body in psychoanalysis, both clinically in treatment and theoretically. And before I introduce our presenter for this evening, I want to quickly just run through who the rest of our presenters will be for this season, and I'll be very brief here. The next one is Saturday, October 21st. It won't be on a Wednesday, it will be a Saturday, because of the presenter is Cecilia Tayana, and the title of her paper is What Does Poetry Offer Psychoanalysis? Robert Frost's Sound of Sense. Then in November 15th, we go back to Wednesdays. Nancy Kulish will do a presentation on the abject, clinical manifestations of hatred of the feminine. There's no meeting in December, which is typical. Then in January on the 17th, Wednesday the 17th, Bruce Reese will present his presentation on Freud's animality. Saturday the 24th of February is Avi Sakatopoulou with the title that we have yet to receive from her. That's a Saturday again because she's on the East Coast. Then Wednesday, March 20th will be Nancy Winters. Title of her presentation is The Body as an Internal Group, Voices from Beyond's Dawn of Oblivion. Then Wednesday, April 17th, the next month, Karen Harang will present on Enid Young's Addictions. And Karen, I didn't get an official title for that.
That's the draft title. Stay tuned.
Okay. Then Wednesday, May the 15th, I'm scheduled to present on the topic, it's called Après Coup on Trauma and the Fate of the Angel, which is a paper that I wrote about 13 years ago that's never published, and a process of an après coup. It's about the trauma of the analyst and the interdigitation of the trauma of the analyst and events in the world that coalesce within the treatment of several cases. It's a very clinical paper. Wednesday, the 19th, for our final meeting will be Maureen Murphy from San Francisco, and her presentation will be on Huntington's chorea. This has been something she's wanted to present and write about, and so she'll finish out the year. So now I want to introduce Mary, Dr. Mary Brady, for our presentation this evening. It's a pleasure for me because Mary is a dear colleague, but she's also a buddy of mine, and we've worked closely together. So this is a real treat to do this with you, Mary. Mary is an adult and child psychoanalyst in private practice in San Francisco. She's on the faculties of the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis and the Psychoanalytic Institute of Northern California, PINC. She is editor of Braving the Erotic Field in the Treatment of Children and Adolescents, and this was published in August, in 2022. And I think the title is reversed on here because of the screen, but this is the book, and she'll be presenting tonight from one of the chapters in the book. Her books, other books that she's written, Analytic Engagements with Adolescents and The Body in Adolescence, were published by Routledge in 2018 and 2016, respectively. She is the North American co-chair for the IPA's Committee on Child Analysis, the acronym is COCAP. And she also co-leads a group which is Psychoanalysis and Film, which I'm a member of, which is a delightful group where we analyze psychoanalytically films and we pick a topic each year. So, Mary, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here. As Drew said, he's an old buddy of mine, and also I happily know Karen and Nancy. And I've heard how lovely this group is. So I'm very glad to be here. And this topic, is one in some ways I've worked on for, I was thinking today, 35 years. I wrote my dissertation on gender differences in the expression of erotic transference in analysis. And so in all that time, how we have these preoccupations that we keep coming around about. And so this paper then came out of my training as a child analyst years ago. And then the book kind of followed the paper. And one of the pleasures of writing the book is that you get to see so many variations in erotic transference and countertransference. For instance, Drew has a paper in that book that he neglected to mention. And so with his, there's a sort of issue of sex being equated with death, for the boy. And so those issues are quite different than for my boy. His is a young boy, late adolescent young man. And then also I'll just mention, the paper that I start with in the book, which is one by Ann Alvarez, which is about kids that enter treatment with a sexualized symptom, which is very different than the boy I'm talking about. It was kind of 2 years into the analysis that the erotic transference, countertransference really emerged. And so there are very different issues in what happened. Anne talks about this boy that would kind of leer at her feet, but he kind of came in the door with that symptom. Whereas with with the kind of situation I'm talking about, where something develops well into analysis, I think there's a lot about the intimacy of the analytic setting, and then how closely tied that is with the erotic, and so then how to move around in that. And let's see, was there one other thing I wanted to say? Oh, I mean, just that, and I'll be talking about this in the paper, but you could think, Freud started, from the beginning of psychoanalysis with putting the erotic at the center, and yet so little is written or said about the erotic and adolescents, working with the erotic with children and adolescents. And so that would seem like a very strange thing, when you think about, and kids going through puberty while we're seeing them, and and obviously full of hormones and full of experimenting with sexuality and gender, and yet so little has been written about it. And so for us to think about tonight, why that is, and also these variations of what it's like in the room with different issues involving the erotic. So anyway, so this is my paper, Braving the Erotic Field in the Treatment of Adolescents. I find my patients' bodies and my body to be more directly the subjects of analysis with adolescents than with adults or with younger children. Erotic transference and countertransference can be particularly fraught because of the intensity of emergent bodily sensations in the adolescent and because of her or his normal developmental immaturity. Adolescents need help to name and integrate their newfound bodily experiences. Their minds need to grow into the bodies they now inhabit. It's a challenge for analysts to talk about feelings the adolescent has barely begun to name. Indeed, budding sexuality and the memories and feelings it stirs in us of our own sexual beginnings are no small things to metabolize. And yet, with rare exceptions, as I was just saying, the area of erotic transference, countertransference in the treatment of adolescents is largely ignored in analytic writing. The catastrophic prospect of boundary violations, particularly with minors, can lead to a timid avoidance of the erotic in our work with adolescents, yielding what I call here an erotic insufficiency. The analyst can fear exploiting the trust necessary for an adolescent to bring his or her emerging sexuality into analysis in a lively manner. Feelings that arouse the greatest conflict and guilt in the analyst are precisely those that are most vulnerable to our defensive rejection. And I'll just say, in thinking about how little this seemed written about, I did a quick PEP web scan, and there were 1,785 references in the analytic literature for erotic transference, 592 for erotic countertransference, 15 for erotic transference adolescents, and only 3 for erotic countertransference with adolescents. So those are kind of dramatic numbers that I think are, saying something important to us. In order to consider these issues, I'll relate a period in the analysis of a 12-year-old boy when the erotic transference and countertransference were at a height. I will also suggest that the terms erotic transference and erotic countertransference don't fully capture the intensely interactional nature of these experiences. And so I suggest erotic field better conveys this fluidity. The body of the adolescent is changing radically before his or her own eyes, as well as before mine. Adolescent boys can shoot up a foot in height over a couple of years. Brian, age 13, encountered me in the hallway, and this boy wound up being 6'7" when he grew up. And so one day when he was, a mid-teenager, he encountered me in the hallway before a session and said, "Have you always been that short?" His body was new in many ways and led to new experiences in relation to himself, me, and everyone else. Naomi, a pubertal girl, having had the puberty sex talk at school that day, asked me with utter sincerity, "What's puberty for?" I was struck that though I could answer the question in a limited biological sense, the larger psychological and emotional meanings of what puberty would mean to her would take years to comprehend. Evelyn, a 16-year-old in analysis, spoke about being on the verge of having intercourse with her boyfriend. I asked her, "Do you think having sex will change anything inside you or between us?" At first she demurred, but soon said that having intercourse will be the end of childhood. Sometimes teenagers say, these things that stick with you for a lifetime. Something would definitively change inside her, as well as between us and between her and her parents. She would cross a line from her child bodily self to an adult bodily self, and there would no longer be a substantive divide between her experiences and those of adults in a sexual sense. Experience would be gained, but a precious boundary that allowed some element of childhood to remain, all too scarce for this girl, would be lost. Around this time, Evelyn asked to use the couch. her use of the couch was different than any I have experienced before or since. She was in constant motion and reminded me of a seal. She would flip from side to side and then flip over on her stomach to look at me. My experience was of not being able to think with all this motion, and I remember very well wishing she would just lie still. Evelyn was giving me an experience of how much commotion she felt inside. Evelyn asked to use the couch in order to talk about sexuality. My agreement for her to lie down evoked intimate and erotic feelings in her towards me. Soon after starting to use the couch, she told me of making out with her boyfriend in his car for the first time. She said, "I found myself tracing your initials in the steam on the window." As we explored this action, it seemed that I was present both in Evelyn's erotic feelings and that she was summoning me to help her create some breaks, BRAKES, to allow a thinking space while making out with her boyfriend, not so easy to do. And then just to say that I'm going to skip, there's a whole part of this chapter that's on, kind of review of some of the most important papers in the erotic transference and countertransference adult literature, but I think that's fairly well known, and it's also there if you're interested. And I'm going to comment just briefly on the very little there is in about erotic transference with adolescents. And let's see, I had another. What was I going to say? Something slipped my mind. Hopefully, it will return. So the seminal paper, which is really quite amazing to say that there's a paper that's kind of a first paper about directly thinking about the erotic transference and countertransference, but is Ann Alvarez's, which is in 2012 and called Types of Sexual Transference and Countertransference in Work with Children and Adolescents. And that and so I use it as the first chapter in my book because it's gathering something up. She distinguishes amongst, and these are her words, perverse, disordered, and normal sexual transferences in children and adolescents. And I say this because, she in this paper is coming from a kind of Kleinian view where you're thinking of a diagnostic picture in the child or adolescent in order to help the analyst think about, what's needed in working with them. But in moving towards field theory, which is part of what I'm doing in the book, field theorists wouldn't agree at all with that sort of calling a child as having a perverse transference. They might think of it as a perverse field. And so, this is a particular way of thinking. So by perverse, she means a dangerously addictive sexuality with sadistic and masochistic elements. By disordered, she indicates an addictive but not fully perverse sexuality. And by normal, and she has this lovely way of saying things, she denotes the child or adolescent's desire to make someone's eyes light up, and the need for a responsive, interested object capable of being delighted. Adolescent treatment requires a freedom to experience and tolerate intense feelings while attempting to neither overstimulate nor neglect sexual feelings. The following vignette is an excellent example of this. So this is Emil Jackson, who also has a chapter in my book. He describes his response when Sarah, who he sometimes feels to be, quote, the apple of my eye, tells him that she has kissed a close friend of her boyfriend. He says, the intensity of the impact this had on me was startling. I experienced it like a personal assault, a body blow, affecting my whole physiology and evoking something not far off, a sense of outrage as if she had actually been unfaithful to me. The intensity of Jackson's reaction jarred him and gradually led him to understand that Sarah had experienced their recent agreement for her to use the couch as a sexual enactment. Jackson's subsequent vacation break had thus felt like a betrayal to her. As he reflected on his intense reaction, Jackson became more active in interpreting how his breaks could feel like, in his words, a violation of the therapy and the therapeutic relationship. That's what he said to her. Sarah then tells him that she had kissed the boy to hurt him more than her boyfriend. Jackson replies, I acknowledge the importance of what she was saying about how angry, jealous, and cheated on she felt by me over Easter, adding that perhaps now I needed to know what that was like, including what it was like to feel sexually jealous. Jackson keeps a close eye to the effect of his comments on his patient. While always important, this close attunement to how our words are experienced is only more important in this erotic territory. And this next section I call erotic insufficiency and erotic playback. The emerging bodily experiences of the adolescent, first menstruation, first wet dream, first masturbation to orgasm, and so on. You have these funny experiences with kids, or one girl said to me, my sister has started to have hair under one arm and not the other. These kind of odd experiences we all have of, beginning to have pubic hair, etc. But these experiences are parts of a virgin territory. That's actually a phrase you're going to have Nancy Coolish. She has a very nice paper where she talks about this virgin territory. For the analyst, the patient's pubertal development can rouse feelings of venturing into a particularly taboo, forbidden, loaded, and vulnerable area. This can create hesitancy and inhibition in us, making us less likely to be able to stand for the acceptance and containment of these sensations and emotions. Samuels, a post-Jungian analyst, he's one of the kind of most prominent Jungians, suggests that, these are his words, the subtle damage and deprivation caused by erotic deficit is far less spoken of than what is caused by erotic excess. Physical incest takes place at an appallingly high frequency, but something equally central and much more benevolent in sexuality is being overlooked. And so he means both in the family and in analysis. Back to me, prefer the term erotic insufficiency to erotic deficit, as deficit implies a lack of capacity. While I think that therapists' avoidance of the erotic is often caused more by discomfort and anxiety than incapacity. Samuels describes erotic playback in parenting and in clinical processes. He says, in the family, this is the way in which the parent communicates to children of both sexes that they are admirable, physically desirable, and erotically viable creatures. Of course, in a family or an analysis, I'm referring only to incest fantasy and not to the physical enactment of such fantasy. Again, that's the end of the quote from him. He adds that the erotic includes more than sex. It also encompasses harmony, relatedness, purpose, significance, and meaning. Eros, again, his words. He says, this means, of course, that ambivalence, anxiety, jealousy, rivalry, and a sense of lack will also be present. Samuel's concept of erotic playback is not simplistic. He sees sexual identity as not unified, fixed, static, eternal, or universal. Erotic playback encourages the individual to think of himself or herself in a diversified way, to come alive and hold together in the mind all aspects of the self, including body areas. Samuels acknowledges that erotic playback is vulnerable to misattunement as well as more egregious failures. Diana Leese, one of our colleagues down here, again, she has a chapter in the book as well, defines analytic eroticism as the aesthetic capacity to keep embodied vitality alive in the analytic relationship. She compares analytic eroticism to Kristeva's discussion of maternal eroticism. She says, the encounter with the mother as erotic being brings into being the child's erotic self, both in the specifically sexual and in the most general sense, vitality and living, a curious and creative engagement with life, eros. A simple and lovely example comes to mind. 7-year-old Spencer came to his session dressed in a collared shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. He told me it had been picture day at school and that his mother told him he was wearing his handsome shirt. How beautiful, natural, and subtly she was sowing the seeds of his developing sense of being an attractive and desirable boy and future man. As parents or analysts, we do not often consciously set out to provide our children or patients erotic playback. Perhaps we have trouble naming that along with the growth of the mind, we also hope to help free the growth of erotic aliveness in our patients, both sexually and in related forms. Timid avoidance of erotic feelings in the consulting room deprives adolescents of sincere adult thinking in relation to the challenges of enjoying and managing sexual feelings. The analyst's capacity to be aware of his or her erotic feelings, but not to act on them, comes across in many ways. And so now this is the clinical material with the boy I saw, and the title of this section is called Pick Up Sticks. Frank, a sensitive 12-year-old boy with a cool teenage demeanor, appeared at least 2 years older than his actual age. He was in analysis for depression following his parents' divorce. And I don't go into the material in the writing because of identifying kinds of issues, but just to say the mother was very depressed, and both before and after the father left her, and the father had cheated on her. So from the beginning, the boy ostensibly didn't know this in starting, but he clearly did, because one of the first things that happened, so he was kind of walking around my office, and I had a notepad on my desk that was from the olden days when the American psychoanalytic meetings used to be at the Waldorf. And so he knew what the Waldorf was. And so he picked up the pad, and what his association to it was that I was having an affair at the Waldorf, so the sexual was immediately in the room, although, in kind of feeling more between us was later. As I said, his mother was depressed and collapsed in the beginning in relation to her husband's departure, but also suffered from a more chronic depression, which had predated this event. Now, 2 years into the analysis, Frank's depression had diminished and an erotic transference developed, partly under the pressure of puberty and also in response to our having begun a 4th weekly session. Frank had agreed to a 4th session, but because he could see that our work was helping him to use his mind more actively to sort out his feelings from his mother's feelings. It's kind of a feeling of his mind coming to life. He had observed, when my mother is depressed, I feel like I can feel her feelings. I think they became his feelings, not just that he could notice them in her. His mother accepted my recommendation of a 4th session because she was concerned both about Frank's stutter and about some of Frank's, what she called, risky friends. Frank felt that I had a special interest in him, as demonstrated by my wanting to see him so often. He at first complained that the 4th session was too much time and took away from other things. However, at one point, I noted aloud that he seemed distant following my having been away. I commented, "It's easy to feel if someone is not there that they don't care about you." He replied, "I know you care about me because of the 4th session." This was the end of the hour, and before he got up, and I'll just mention, so we were sitting on the floor, and parenthetically, this is another piece of child and adolescent treatment. Physically, you're closer, like here we were sitting on the floor playing pickup sticks, so, a foot or two apart. Then another spot I'll tell you in a moment, we were sitting at the play table. And so, you're just literally hands can touch, that sort of thing. It's the intimacy of the physical setting is also different. So, as I said, this was the end of the hour, and before he got up, he touched my leg with one of the pickup sticks we'd been playing with and commented that my stockings were shiny. I'm reminded of Freud's comment in Observations on Transference Love that the analyst has evoked this love by instituting analytic treatment in order to cure the neurosis. But I'll also say that Donald Moss had read an early version of this paper, and he quite hysterically drew attention to the idea, the double entendre of pickup sticks, that the boy was kind of picking me up in a sense. At times I noticed Frank looking at my breasts. Another time he looked at my legs and said, "Are they stockings?" I said, "Guys your age are often curious about girls' things like stockings and underwear. Another thing about your age is that there are a lot of intense changes in one's body that can often feel hard to talk about." Frank replied with emotion, "I know what you mean. I'm beginning to have acne, and other people my age aren't getting it yet." He always was having to struggle with, he was always the tallest, he kind of wished he could be more in the middle. He couldn't borrow his friend's sweatshirt if he, left it behind because he was always the biggest. In another session, and this is what I meant by we were sitting at the play table, he touched my wedding ring and asked, "What stone is it?" I said, "You may be wondering not just what stone, but what the ring means." He says, "That you're married." And I said, "Maybe, but then there's also what that means to you because you're pretty close to me." He said, "Have you seen the movie When Harry Met Sally? The man in the movie didn't notice the woman at first." And he kind of trailed off. And I said, "You were noticing girls more in general, but also noticing me in that way." It was near the end of the session, and Frank was tracing the veins in his forearm with his finger. I thought it was quite a, sensual sort of, touch. It was I don't know quite how to put it. It didn't feel self-conscious. I guess it felt like some, just some relationship to his body that I don't remember having seen before. He was tracing the veins in his forearm with his finger. I was struck by the change in his forearm over the 2 years I had seen him. His forearm had changed from that of a boy to that of a man. At that moment, I felt attracted to him in the same way as I might toward an adult man. At 12, he had already largely developed the body of a man. It has often been observed that it's a challenge for girls who menstruate early, 9 or 10 these days, to integrate their experiences, having had less time for antecedent emotional and cognitive development. It's also true for boys who have the bodies of men without the same psychological development. Frank hummed the wedding march under his breath another day, and more than once slipped and asked why we had not met on the 5th day, on which we did not have an appointment. I pointed out he might be wishing we met that day as well. I mentioned the possibility of a 5th session to his mother, who spoke of it to her brother. Frank's mother and uncle seemed to have an underlying suspicion regarding my interest in Frank. Indeed, I had to struggle to sort out my own feelings of attraction to Frank, to keep myself from withdrawing from him due to anxiety about my erotic countertransference. The following interchange seems to capture the incestuous aspects of the transference and the anxieties surrounding it. Frank said, I was reading about a bank robber who got shot 9 times, shot through the mouth, tongue, teeth. With leprosy, could you have a finger fall off? And I was hearing this as very kind of loaded material. And so this next comment is the kind of playing for time comment. I said, where did you hear about that possibility? He said, in history class, I think it could happen. I said, it reminds me of an old wives' tale that if a guy masturbates enough, his penis could fall off. It's not true, but I guess it comes from that part of the guy's body being really important to him. Frank nods here. And worrying something could happen to it. He said, in drama class today, we were done with work, so we were just chilling, and somebody raised the story of a teacher who had sex with her 12-year-old student, and he got her pregnant. You probably remember the story. It was in Texas, maybe 30 years ago or something, 25 years, something like that. Well, must have been more like 20 if he's talking about it. So the teacher who had sex with her 12-year-old student and he got her pregnant, she was married and had 3 children. She went to jail, and when she got out, he got her pregnant again. I said, and what did you think about that story? He said, it's weird. 24 years older is a little bit of a problem. She was 36, and he trails off. I said, and I'm sure I was gulping inside. I said, maybe you're uncomfortable talking about it, as I'm an older woman you're close to, and you're 12. And so he didn't say anything more directly here, but I felt that this crystallized the transference, countertransference situation. I told him, I don't think it was good what happened between the teacher and student, but I wouldn't want you to think such feelings are weird. As I say, I gulped internally as I linked this loaded story about the teacher and the boy directly to our relationship. There had been many indicators of Frank's feelings, so it did not feel premature. I also felt that I was not being seductive, but naming something implicit to make it more explicit. There could be reasons to allow material to continue to evolve in derivative form, or at other times it could feel overstimulating to make a direct link to the analytic couple. And I have to say, when I sent this paper off, I just really hesitated before I pressed send in a way I haven't with any other paper. And this came out first in the Journal of Child Psychotherapy. And I mean, I think they really liked the paper, but they said also, like, I felt like they were having a reaction of like, tell people not to do this at home, like make sure and say when you would not do this. And so, I'll say a little bit more about that later. But as I look back many years later, this comment to me, linking it directly to our relationship, has a feeling of rightness. The situation in the room was stimulating, a boy going through puberty and an older woman. I felt attracted to Frank as I might to a man, including some preoccupation with these feelings outside of sessions. I believe that in my work with Frank, I always kept in mind that he was a boy and my patient, but the transitions occurring within him were stimulating to him and to me. Soon after, Frank told me that his uncle asked, "Did your analyst propose yet?" Frank said, "It's weird you want me to come so much since most people go once or twice a week." I said, "Sometimes people are uncomfortable with positive feelings, but I imagine you felt confused about whose ideas to be loyal to." Frank nodded. He seemed to register that sharing and understanding his loving and sexual feelings could be helpful to him. And so that's kind of the end of the clinical vignette, and then I'll, my comments on it. So my comments to Frank were intended to have an open-ended, unsaturated in Beyond's terms quality to allow Frank's feelings, thoughts, and experiences to develop further. An analyst must be willing to brave this territory if she expects her patient to likewise be able to. While it is often useful to proceed in an unsaturated manner, it is especially true in relation to the bodily changes and sensations of adolescence, which are so big that they can only be taken in gradually. When helping an adolescent to name erotic feelings, we're also indirectly implying certain attitudes towards sexuality, that it's there, that sexuality is part of us, that even very intense feelings can be shared. When I look back at this material, it seems right to me that I did not interpret Frank's story about the teacher in relation to incestuous feelings towards his mother, while of course there'd be an element of truth to this. Such a genetic interpretation would have been avoidant of the immediate erotic feelings in the room and could have signaled to Frank my unwillingness to be close to his feelings. An analyst might not directly interpret derivative material in some situations. The perverse children described by Alvarez might take such an interpretation in an addictive direction and be unable to use it to think. Sexually overstimulated or abused adolescents might be better served by discussing sexuality in more derivative form, as they have been too often victim to sexuality that crashes through. Over concrete children, such as those on the autism spectrum, would be unlikely to use an explicit transference interpretation fluidly, rendering such comments useless or confusing. Although I have to say again, these are generalizations, so of course they're not always right. Nancy was mentioning a boy on the spectrum just before we started that, that I think she feels something might have been quite useful to say. So maybe we'll hear more about that. Also, a therapist must consider the level of preparatory groundwork that might allow intense feelings to be addressed more directly. Frank had already been in analysis for 2 years when erotic feelings emerged, and we had weathered some other storms. Analysts must always observe reactions to what we've said and have an attitude of humility that while we may have intended a comment one way, it may be experienced in another. It's my impression that interpreting this material to Frank more explicitly was useful. Leaving these feelings unnamed, as I said, could imply they were too catastrophic to identify. Instead, very loaded feelings were named and the boundaries and purposes of our work remained in place. Retrospectively, the erotic transference-countertransference with Frank emerged at a specific time in the treatment in the context of intensive work and has been more in the background subsequently. From a field theory point of view, this constitutes a shared dreaming of the couple. Shortly after my patient's erotic transference reached a height at age 13, he started a romantic relationship with a girl his age. She remained his girlfriend for the next 2 years. I was impressed with Frank's growing ability to talk directly with her about his feelings. I believe that the erotic transference experienced with an emotionally available but safe object became a launching ground for Frank's own erotic life. I thought that his experience of having a single object who was paying attention to him and to whom he was paying attention allowed for a deepening of an impressive capacity for intimate feelings. And this is an interesting thing when you have adolescents in analysis, that while they come with certain problems, sometimes you see them develop a capacity that's kind of well beyond their age for a kind of intimacy and an ability to talk about things. And that's part of the pleasure of the work. Frank's mother's depression likely made the potentiating capacity of eroticism, in Diana Lisa's words, more important in the analytic relationship than it might have been had these feelings been more reciprocally available in a parental relationship. And again, I don't say much about it here, but father was really quite overstimulating, and then mother wished she could be more available, but she never really could be very much. Adolescents frequently present with bravado, which masks their developmental unreadiness for some experiences. The period of erotic transference, countertransference allowed Frank a trying on of feelings and fantasies. Adolescent treatment often has this quality. A dress rehearsal is allowed for issues that feel unsafe, either for reasons of conflict or developmental unreadiness. Adolescents often experience first love with an unavailable object. You know, you think of all of those posters of our teen idols on the walls. But, you know, while being preoccupied with someone unavailable, growth is happening. My experience of Frank's erotic transference is much as Harold Searles described it in his 1959 paper, Oedipal Love and the Countertransference. And I'll say that's the paper that sparked my dissertation. I can still to this day remember reading that paper in the stacks. You know, there's very few papers that you could think of remembering reading at a particular moment, but that, you know, that's certainly one of my favorite papers. So in that paper, he says that the child accepts that his Oedipal strivings are unrealizable, not primarily through fear of and identification with the forbidding rival parent, but instead, here's a quote from him, through the ego-strengthening experience of finding that the beloved parent reciprocates his love, responds to him, that is, as being a worthwhile and lovable individual, as being, indeed, a conceivably desirable love partner, and renounces him only with an accompanying sense of loss on the parent's own part. This child emerges with his ego strengthened out of the knowledge that his love, however unrealizable, is reciprocated. And again, very few vignettes I could relate from analytic papers, but there's just, to me, an absolutely wonderful vignette in that paper of him. He was at Chestnut Lodge at the time and taking a schizophrenic patient he had worked with out for rides in his car, and, you know, having the fantasy that this was them going on their honeymoon, and noticing that before going to work in the mornings, he would be picking a tie, particularly for this, with this patient in mind. And so, you know, the loveliness of this, you know, this experience for both of them and this relationship. So in that vein, Jody Davies, an American relational analyst whom you probably know, suggests that erotic transference can be infantilized and seen only in pre-Oedipal or Oedipal dimensions. She suggests that as infantile conflicts are understood in analysis, then, her words, the rich efflorescence, not the disappearance of passionate desire in the analytic relationship, often ensues. Within the relatively safe confines of the analytic space, there is a freedom to experience those aspects of sexual desire and erotic fantasy that are part of emergent self-experiences. Again, her words. Davies relates a riveting moment from her own family life, which she felt informed her understanding of emergent adolescent sexuality. She and her husband were engrossed in a conversation when their daughters, who had been playing dress up, ran by. The 12-year-old, now back to her words, had piled her long dark hair on top of her head and had put on a clingy black jersey slit up the side. The outfit was completed with black fishnet stockings, patent leather high heels, and a red garter. I was astounded, but her father let slip an almost imperceptible but still subliminally audible gasp, a gasp heard loud and clear by this very vulnerable daughter woman and her then immobilized but horrified mother. In a series of microseconds, meaningful looks of danger and confusion ricocheted spitfire around this now palpable triangle, and my daughter, crying hysterically, ran from the room. Gathering himself, Davy's husband went to talk to his daughter. Later, equilibrium apparently restored, Davies asked what he had said to accomplish this. I told her the truth, he said, that I had never seen her looking so beautiful before. And in the writing, there's a ... in such a grown-up way, ... that it had taken my breath away, ... that I liked it, ... but that it was something I was going to have to get used to. Did she say anything? Jody Davies asked. And her husband said no, but she smiled the most beautiful smile. And then he smiled. Davies suggests that her husband's honest acknowledgement allows a beginning recognition of adolescent emergent sexual subjectivity. The adolescent can experience being the object of another's sexual response in a reasonably titrated manner when the response feels both forthright and contained. I was struck by the pauses in her husband's speech, which Davies represented, 3 times by these ... These pauses seem to me a helpful communication in themselves, as they imply that one can pause and stop to think when amidst tumultuous feelings. The analyst of an adolescent must be able to withstand a series of anxieties in relation to sexuality. Is what we're talking about too much? Is it too exciting? Is my interest too voyeuristic? In order to help the adolescent tolerate her or his own excitements and anxieties, this willingness to tread in an anxiety-provoking area can hopefully lend what I call erotic sufficiency to our work with adolescents. Davies suggests analysts' ability to contain their own desires with self-awareness equates to parents' observance of the incest prohibition. Such self-containment creates and protects a gap in which the patient's subjectivity can come into its own. Ricardo Lombardi comments, adolescence involves confrontation with a choice that becomes decisive for all subsequent development. This choice consists of either facing up to adolescent turbulence or mobilizing all possible strategies to avoid it. And sometimes you see the kids who, like, they've been planning their resume for Yale all along, and you feel like they are just totally bypassing, this necessary disequilibrium, and that it doesn't bode well in some ways. The period of treatment that I mentioned felt turbulent to me as well as I imagine to Frank. While I don't think I was inappropriate or flirtatious in the sessions, outside of the hours, I thought I must be losing my mind to have strong feelings of attraction to a 12, 13-year-old. In retrospect, I think that Frank and I were able to sustain turbulence without closing it down too quickly, yielding an erotic sufficiency. My work with Frank took place now 20 years ago when I was still a candidate in child analysis. And I was fortunate, I had 3 adolescents in analysis when I was a candidate. And it was a very fortunate thing because they remain very vivid to me, but also, it really launched some serious considerations like this one and, with treating anorexia, treating substance abuse. So they really put you in a kind of crucible. But as I reflect on this piece of work now, I'm struck that my experience with Frank was of a bipersonal field. And, that's the Italian field theory and the Berenger's field theory. They're different strains, but somewhat related, or similar to Ogden's idea of the analytic third, though my Freudian supervision at the time did not employ these terms. My experience was of a continuous exchange of emotional elements through dreams and narratives. So this is a sort of field theory way of thinking, such as that of the 12-year-old impregnating his 36-year-old teacher as a sort of narrative in the field. Find a way, now this is Farrow's words, who's a field theorist, find a way of expressing and narrating what is going on in the depths of the relational exchange. Shared meanings and feelings could be elaborated with Frank in a way that did not have to be too pinned down. Meanings could continually take shape from a shared, though not on my part explicitly expressed, experience of erotic and romantic longings. These longings could also encounter a reality of limits in the relationship and the allowance that these longings be transformed for other purposes, such as Frank's assumption of his romantic and erotic life. It's interesting that while coming from a Freudian view that emphasized the intrapsychic, my supervisor seemed entirely comfortable with this way of working. The supervision I was in was instrumental in helping me not to inhibit erotic feelings in my relationship with Frank. The use of a consultant may be particularly important at such times to help to think while feeling and to feel while thinking. In the context of the above clinical moment, I recall my supervisor saying that it was good that I liked males, implying that Frank did not have to be deprived of the subtle ways this would come across in my interactions with him. I'm reminded of Diana Lisa's comment, what of the analyst's libidinal investment in that unique patient, in that analysis? An analysis cannot rest on the patient's libidinal energies alone. We might think of erotic energy as circulating in multiple directions in the intersubjective field of an analysis, a libidinally alive matrix. A clinical situation of, this is Diane again, a clinical situation of vibrancy can foster patients' increased libidinal investment in themselves. It's interesting to consider how the work with Frank might have been different with a heterosexual male analyst or a gay or lesbian analyst. And again, in the book, we have a whole variety of pairs, which is interesting. It's important for all analysts to be able to be fluid and imaginative in experiencing ourselves as male or female, father or mother, or potentially in a homosexual, heterosexual, or gender fluid role with the patient. Still, it seems to me that the specific genders of the pair are important, and perhaps especially so at puberty. Some early adolescent female patients relate to me as if I may be able to help them figure out the mysteries that are befalling them. After all, I have gone through some version of the bodily changes they're going through. In the current clinical material, the constellation of a heterosexual boy in early adolescence and a heterosexual female analyst may have allowed a particularly intense version of feelings that surely would also have been present in some form with this patient and a different analyst. The terms erotic transference and countertransference, as I say, seem too static to capture the fluidity, subtlety, or complexity that I think are better conveyed in the dynamic concept of an erotic field. Stephen Hartman, in a memorial paper for Muriel Dimon, highlights her complex use of field theory. He says, better to speak to, in, the erotic field than to codify it as the patient's erotic transference. To reify the transference is to forget that recursively to reflect on desire and to contain it enhance each other. When I think back to the period in my work with Frank when erotic feelings were in the forefront, it feels almost impossible to say, whose feeling is it? Frank experienced my recommendation of frequent sessions as a possible seduction. His looking at my body was stimulating to me. I think of the complexity of any single moment, such as when Frank traced the veins on his forearm and I felt attracted to him. This was my feeling, located in me and unspoken, but Frank's subtle and unself-conscious action might also represent a new sensuality and budding awareness of his body, which I was also reacting to. At times, feelings might belong mainly to one member of the analytic couple. Frank felt frustrated that I did not let him in on my private life, but even such an experience that was mainly his includes a whole history of familial boundary experiences for both patient and analyst. Such personal experience of boundaries would necessarily in some way become part of the erotic field. And so this is the very end of the paper. Analytic work with adolescents brings words like visceral, intense, in motion, and palpable to mind. The changing body of the adolescent patient presents particular challenges to containment and pressures towards enactment in the treatment of adolescents. Lombardi notes, quote, a lack of experience with the adult world establishes the necessity for the adolescent to act in order to know. As I completed this paper, I thought about its title. Is it entering the erotic field with the adolescent patient or some other verb? What about surviving or tolerating or enjoying or playing in or braving? As I mulled over these verbs, they all have some element of truth, but braving seemed the most fitting, and thus the title. I'll end the paper with Anne Alvarez's reminder that, quote, sometimes the positive transference is harder to take and stay with than the negative, and when it is sexual too, it demands much courage, honesty, and respect from us in our countertransference responses. Thank you.
If we can unmute and clap.
Thank you, dear.
Great.
Fantastic.
Oh, Mary. I want to give a lot of room for people to, I don't want to break up the stream here. I do want to just say that beyond being a colleague and a friend, this is such brave writing
Thank you, dear.
in a very particular way that is so useful. And in this read through with you, what I felt was the humility of that adolescents have so much to teach us about our bodily experience in ways that we may have foreclosed in our own development. I don't know. It just seems so it's a lovely way of thinking about how you worked with countertransference, and it's just so admirable. I'm so thankful for what I learned with you. I'm going to leave that there and ask people to open your hearts and minds and mouths.
Drew, do you want people to use the raised hand emoji?
Thank you. It would be helpful if you can use the emoji of raising your hand. Yes. That'll show me the order in which you want to speak.
And I will just say to what you said, Drew, that that is what is so wonderful about working with adolescents is they are so immediate, and that we fortunately for us sometimes have a little more, we've wrapped our minds around things more or managed things more, but the immediacy is very compelling and certainly reminds us of many things in ourselves.
Karen.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was such an enjoyable experience. Listening to you read your writing, and in that way, there was an embodied quality in hearing you read it as compared with just reading the words on the page. But one of the things that it brought to mind, my very first job after graduate school, when I was living in Washington, D.C., was at T.C. Williams High School, which was half Black, half white. It was the first integrated football team. And I was the drug counselor and educator at that school. And I had my office in the school. And, just very, very new to any kind of clinical practice. And my first case was the entire basketball team who got caught all drinking on the school bus. And these were, when you were talking about this boy who was, grew to be 6'7", very tall. These guys were, towered over me. So here I am supposed to be the expert. And these guys were just completely physically intimidating. Right. And I divided them into groups, and we met for 3 sessions each one. But what I wanted to get to is that their way of dealing with me being white and all of them being Black was to assign a nickname. And I had 2 nicknames. One was Shorty. I remember your patient saying to you, have you always been that short?
Right.
One was Shorty and the other was Slim.
Uh-huh.
And it didn't occur to me then, but it does now, of how body centric those names were. And it helped them feel like they had some footing with me, this supposed expert. And for whatever the reasons, I intuitively knew that it wasn't an insult. They weren't trying to be disrespectful, but to find their footing in relating to me as this authority figure. And what was interesting is that I had my office there for several years, and the nickname continued. And so I'd be walking down the hallway, and one of the kids who, way over 6 feet would say, hey, Shorty, hey, Slim. And then they defer to my name, which was different than it is now. But the bodily component of it was something that it's only now, decades later, thanks to your presentation, that I realized what an important component that was of how we found our way of relating to one another. So thank you.
No, it's lovely. And that, you could say the Slim is even edging into the erotic, but, obviously it isn't what you would bring up in that setting, but so lovely that you could, just roll with the nicknames they gave you, and that then, you're kind of playing in their territory and meeting them halfway. And I think, you just can't be too formal with teenagers, or you're dead. So that, sounds quite an experience.
Thank you, Karen. Michael Weeks. Hi.
Hi,
And then
thank you.
and then Sonia.
That was I really enjoyed that. It answered a question for me about what I began feeling after working with a later stage adolescent and increasing from 2 sessions a week to 3 times a week, and experiencing myself just thinking about this person all the time, and it just all at once. And so I think that was informative. One thing I was wondering a little bit about
Want to say a little bit more about what you think it meant to you, and between the two of you, the increase?
That is an excellent question. It's kind of going on now, and I'm talking to my consultant and my own psychotherapist or psychoanalyst about this. I'm not sure if it was a caretaking feeling that I was responding to, to be taken care of, or more of an erotic transference, or both. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that. That's called a redirect.
Pass me that ball, huh? Well, I will answer with I had a dream this week about a boy in analysis. Well, he's not a boy; he's a man now, but it makes me think of your question. I was trying to decide whether to mention it, and I thought they'll think I do nothing but have erotic countertransference. So I hesitated, but I'm just gonna, what the heck. So anyway, this is a now young man I've seen straight through college. I saw him since the end of high school, and the material, I think, is at the moment, we're in person. We've sometimes been on phone, and I would not say it's an erotic transference at all. It's, or in any obvious way. But there's a ton of intimacy. There's a feeling of kind of going through these different moments, and a complexity of feeling, and a depth of relationship. And the dream I had was that he's lying behind me on the couch. I'm, lying in front of him, and that somehow I had thought this was an okay idea, to have this set up as part of the analysis. And he puts his arms around me, and I realize, like, I'm being confusing to him. But I think I was actually dreaming this dream in relation to meeting with all of you, because it's returning to the territory of how intimate this work is, along with how there's so much. I mean, he's older, but still is being just figured out about erotic relationships. And there's to kind of answer your question of sorts, is these things are so close together, that I feel like we're not talking about the erotic in any direct way at all in the work, but there is such a feeling of intimacy that I am taking care of him in a way, but the level of closeness, in a sense, is so much that, the erotic is not quite in the room, but it's also never far off. So these things don't go in boxes,
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Michael. Sonia, unmute.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for this presentation. It was wonderful and so enlightening. I decided to join despite not working with adolescents. I only work with adults because I'm working with a patient in her 30s, a professional woman who has never had a sexual partner, never been kissed, never had any at all experiences that are in our society so expected and so normal and normalizing. And this is the reason this was enlightening to me, because in a way I often think of her as an adolescent. And my question, and hopefully maybe you can help me think about this, is how to think between, so to back up a little bit, you mentioned this in the beginning, that this work evokes very strong memories of our own adolescent experiences and sexual development. And I noticed in my work with her that when I'm feeling like an adult, like I in my regular stance as a therapist, the work is a bit stilted. But when I enter that space of playful adolescence, almost like, oh yeah, totally, I remember how I talked to my girlfriends about this, the work becomes more intimate and more felt and more effective in a way. And my question is, what you said at the very end, like thinking while feeling and feeling while thinking, how in the world can I or anyone negotiate the two? Because both are so important, both are so useful, because, in the role of a therapist, I'm not her girlfriend from middle school. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, no, it's a lovely question, train of thought, and I would think, you've discovered something, that there's something so much more alive, in the room when you're more playful with her. There's some element of the girlfriend, and you think about, that's where our own processing our feelings goes on, because there may be times we feel sort of forced into some corner of someone's insisting we relate to them such and such a way, where it might not be such a good idea. But at other times, again, it's why I like field theory. I would think of it as like that's the dream of the couple right now, is a shared girlfriend sort of dream. And that sometimes it's okay to be inside a dream for a while. I noticed this with kids. And again, I think it's the value of treating kids. Like I have a new little girl who, if I say anything that is asking her about a feeling, she just looks panicked and like I'm intruding and trying to, kind of get something. And, it just, not only do I think it's not useful, but it's problematic, so I really much more stay in the play, and I'm sure at some point that will change, but I'm learning something about her by staying in this mode that feels feels right to her. And so I would think that you're following your patient's material, and that to feel a little free, to not feel forced into our stereotype of how to be a therapist or analyst, but to feel like you can play with it, and you'll learn something by doing that, and it would get kind of speculative to think, maybe she didn't have someone to accompany her, when she was a teenager, but that for whatever reason that you may not know yet, I'm sure there's something quite important about it.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Thank you, Sonia.
And I don't know whether Drew, you may want to say something about, Drew's patient started the analysis by saying that he's starting analysis because he's still a virgin. And so, so also, that was someone younger, but the sense of something not, that the patient hasn't been able to swim into yet,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all I would say is in that situation, I think there was such a terror of not the body per se, but more a terror of what it would mean to embody. And I was thinking about this, Mary, when you were talking about your patient and his development over time into the arm thing. And from a boy arm to a man arm, and what it makes me think about my patient is, I think there was something so terrifying for him to embody a man's body, which would betray a kind of an allegiance to being this special little boy that he was. He couldn't quite bridge being the kind of super talented, special little boy, the apple of his mother's eye kind of thing. And that becoming an adult male and embodied in a male would be the relinquishment of that. So it wasn't so much, I think I said it. I just think that was part of it. So, Nancy Winters in Portland, one of our co-chairs.
There it is.
Well, Mary, you're so inspiring, really. And I think that the way that you talk about your own feelings, your own sexual feelings, and your emotional reactions is so needed in our profession. And there's something about the way that the space that you allow for, create, co-inhabit with your patient. And I really think that you're, you do use the terms transference and countertransference, but you're moving towards the field. I think is I can see from your material that it's necessary. It's not just nice, it's necessary, because something about transference, countertransference is so deadening.
It really is. Yeah, I really agree.
And it just doesn't fit the vitality, the aliveness. And I think it's a real problem in our field, those terms. But just getting to the erotic issues, what I'm finding helpful, just, being with you, kind of feeling it that way, your presentation, is just being aware of the lines that I create myself, that I don't go near, and that I have fear of going, passing the line or crossing. The way in which the field and the more permissive, like the lovely, lovely articles that you talked about with Searles and Jody Davies, which I love those articles as well. But it opens things up. And so something got opened for me that I just wanted to share with you. I have a newish, very young woman patient who's in the sort of youth kind of stage, not really adolescent, not yet adult. But when I started meeting with her, I was aware that I really liked how she dressed. I thought she was really adorable. The clothes and the t-shirts and all the expressiveness, and every part of her clothes being so carefully chosen, So I because I've worked with kids and I see her more as an adolescent, I kind of allowed myself to talk with her about her clothes, but not allowing as much aliveness as was there. And I realized that when I was listening to you, but what really came to me is the last time I met with her, she sat down in my chair. She's not using the couch. She may at some point. She said, I really like your chair. She said, it's not, sometimes chairs, you just fall into them. This is kind of it's sort of comfortable, but it's sort of firm. So I just, really spontaneously said, oh, good, you like my chair. But I didn't see the erotic aspect to it. And so I'm now kind of feeling excited.
Yeah.
She likes my chair.
Yay.
And she told me she likes my chair.
Yeah.
So I think it opens up more. I can see where this, the therapy can go.
Right.
Not that it has to go there, but I can see potential that I wouldn't have seen.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's that it's not deficit, it's that we're a little inhibited about feeling we should enjoy something, right? To think that's my wonderful body she wants to sit on, or that's how much she likes to be with me, and and that why shouldn't we enjoy it, and and yes, and to keep an eye, but not have to inhibit the the feeling or the experience. So so it's I'll look forward to hearing more about that sometime.
Thank you, Nancy. Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much. I felt that was such a extremely generous and well-written paper, and I just would like to read it. So a couple of thoughts that I had while you were speaking, Mary. I was thinking about the name Frank, which of course is a pseudonym that you chose, and how where I was playing with it in my mind was how in your access to your own reverie, which contained a lot of erotic, what we don't want to call countertransference, and I agree with what's been said about transference and countertransference, sort of feels to me like there's something slightly othering about it, or like it splits the field.
You don't want to touch each other with those things, right?
Yeah, it's too like it's And what you said about the bipersonal field and it being essentially recursive. So you had access to your reverie with all this bodily kind of, and I think of sexuality as something that just happens in us. It just whoosh, it's not something we go seeking what's going to be attractive to us. It just occurs to us what is. And in your being able to hold it and be frank with yourself about it felt like that's where I was going with your choice of the name.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's really lovely.
So thank you so much. And I found myself thinking about a patient that has recently only come in person twice. We started during the pandemic, and now she's come into my office twice in the same week.
Great.
And, it's since she's 21, I very much think of her as an adolescent, but just so much sexual has been coming up just this week. So I felt like I was getting this personal, very personal consultation from you while you were speaking. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and as you know, I think you're implying, you know, we could say she must be very excited to be in the same room with you, but you know, why not say, you know, you're both very excited to be in the same room together, and how wonderful, you know, to be able to be after the, you know, the period of being so far apart. And so again, it's just interesting why we're not, you know, we're a bit shy about that instead of frank. And you know, it just really kind of strikes me that, because of course when, you know, this material is from a long time ago, which doesn't mean it feels very, very distant to me. It doesn't. But you know how when you, it just is different when you're in the midst of it than when you've had time to reflect on it. And so, you know, of course, I have had time with this material, but it really makes me laugh that I had that dream, because I think, you know, I was reminding myself that, you know, there's anxiety in the dream, like, uh-oh, how did I get myself into this situation? And, you know, and then kind of having a bit of anxiety about, like, it seems so relevant to now we're talking about this tonight, but, you know, my thought of like, they're going to think all I think about is sex or something, you know, and it's that sort of like, we should be careful about what we think about, or, you know, instead of that, we can feel what we feel and have that experience and have some reflection on it. So I will enjoy the frank idea. You know.
Oh yeah, it's so needed in the profession. So thank you very much. It does feel very brave and important work.
And I'll also just mention that there's an event a week from Sunday that is, the IPA is generously putting on. That's a new series called Reading Child and Adolescent Psychoanalysis. And so they're doing my book first. And so it's someone is going to interview myself and the chapter authors, including Drew. So if people are interested in, it's a free event. And I think it will be really quite lovely, because, you know, when you hear this hour, you're hearing, you know, a certain version of the erotic field, but each chapter, you know, for instance, there's two chapters on little girls, you know, just serendipitously who presented with the symptom of compulsive masturbation, but the work could not be more different. And one case is written by Christine Anziou-Premereur, who's more of a, you know, French drive theorist, and more of an intrapsychic kind of piece of work, excellent piece of work. And then the other is by Elena Molinari, and who is thinking much more in the field. And so there, a lot of the interpretive work goes on actually with the parents, and there's much more of the sense of this girl as the kind of carrier for a sexual disturbance in the family, you know, between the parents. And so it's, you know, it's really quite, you know, wonderful to get to hear a very different way of conceptualizing something. And, you know, sometimes it's also who you have more access to, you know, like the parents in this case, actually both parents were in analysis, but I didn't particularly feel in my work with them that I could was able to engage them at a depth. I was able to engage the mother enough really to support the treatment, and the father's seductiveness was really problematic. And so I didn't really feel like I could do a lot, you know, a substantial amount of work with the parents. Whereas, you know, say with Elena's case, you hear some really lovely work that goes on with the parents. So that's, that's really analytic work with the parents in that, in that particular form. So if anyone wants that, that information, I'd be happy to send it on to you.
Actually, the event is posted on the IPA website
Yeah.
under their events, so you can get the link there, and it's a free event. I think it's going to be really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Drew will be talking about his chapter.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing that. Janelle, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I just so appreciate how normalizing you've helped these experiences to be. It's really helping me to understand a very difficult situation or case of a 35-year-old who feels to me more like a young boy, an adolescent, and I see him virtually 4 times a week, but I think he is dying for me to comprehend his sexuality. He's got this gorgeous black hair, like shoulder length, that he, toys with often. I'm seeing him face to face. He shows me his beautiful arms. He eats popcorn. He has a cat, and he rubs his face in the fur of the cat. And he has also shared with me his desires to go on dates with older women, blonde, whatever. And at the same time, I feel like he wants to enter me and possess me. And so the eroticism feels fraught. And I'm gonna have to get some really good supervision around this. But what I'm wondering is, how different is his eroticism and also my frightened sexual attraction to him? How different is that from a kind of desire for, let's say, an infant or somebody who wants to be inside of you in this kind of embryonic way? And I struggle with that, with him, with this patient.
Yeah. No, it sounds very, very interesting, right? And so, just the visceral way you describe him, and, the showing his arms, it reminds me of, this boy he'd pull up his sweatshirt, the t-shirt would go with it, and it felt like totally like wanting me to see his chest. And so, this sort of, here's my sexuality. And, and again, we have to kind of work through what's our own fear that is, maybe too much of entering into something. And then it sounds like there's something about him that you feel feels like a lot to you, like whatever the entering in feeling, or, maybe does it feel a little bit like being all over you or something?
Yeah, with a head very close to the screen, wanting me to rub his head. And it's a kind of unbounded, an unbounded sort of sexuality, almost sexual addiction sort of experience.
Does he have in his outside life, is there a out of control sexuality, or?
Oh, yep, that's been there. Yeah, it's definitely been there. And that's different though than what you're describing with your patient, this kind of budding, sort of nervous, awareness of some very, very integral part of him.
Right. No, exactly. That it's, the nature of the emergence of something, whether it feels like this is something, somewhat automatic, and someone would be, kind of seductive as a character style, say, that has a different feeling than, something that's just being, the case that someone was talking about with here, I find myself acting like a girlfriend of another teenager. That has a feeling of kind of something's getting discovered. And so I can't quite tell for your patient whether, there's some sort of insistence that's making you uncomfortable, or again, whether it's just as I was saying, that, in this dream I dreamt for you guys, that when you're as involved, I mean, it's the purpose of analysis to be involved at a level that the deepest things emerge. And so, this whole field of the visceral, the hair of the cat, the hair on his head, and so I think that it might be possible, there's another chapter in the book by Giuseppe Civitaresi on transference love. And, he talks about, he uses this phrase of like, we don't need to be afraid that even the most sort of seemingly overpowering sexuality in this sphere can be taken in a kind of dreamlike way, so that so that in some way you bring in the feeling of how close he feels to you and what it's like to feel close. And maybe there's this visceral, it's a closeness in the hair and the fur, and so you don't have to necessarily name it, and you wish I was touching your head kind of thing, but that some the touching is so important, and and sort of in some way letting it have a unpinned down but dreamlike quality might be sort of one way, but and also to continue to dream it until you feel more sure about how you want to move around in it.
Thank you, Janelle. We have 6 minutes. If people that haven't spoken or have a question or a thought. Oh, Mary, hi.
Hi. Well, I just wanted to thank you, Mary. It was really helpful and it felt kind of as unique too, or like I was invited into a different language, which is interesting because it shouldn't feel that different to talk about sexuality. Like I am surprised at how awkward we all are with it, and how difficult it is. And I was thinking about what Sonia brought in, because I have a very similar patient who is 40 and has no sexual experience at all. And I feel like when she's talking about it, I'm pretty awkward, and she's getting a little frustrated with me for not inviting or helping her directly talk about what she wants, and yet she still feels so young, like she feels like she's sort of 8 years old, and jumping into that doesn't. It's so. I think what you're bringing up is that you have to talk on the right level at the right time, at the right level. But at the same time, you can't be too afraid that you're going to somehow be too much. And it's difficult, I think, to get that right.
Yeah, and that sometimes, I mean, it sounds like she has a strong feeling of, wanting you to say something that she doesn't quite know how to say herself or explore herself, and then you have a kind of bit of anxiety of being off or putting your foot into something, and so so there's something interesting there to think about of like, what is the unreadiness that she feels, and then where you might jump into something a bit. And it's a different kind of vignette, but I was thinking about with a new patient I have. She's getting married and she has a very problematic family situation, and she's very like super appropriate, super poised. And I just have the feeling, like I said to her today, I think maybe you want me to be your mother, and I'm not sure which of us is supposed to propose. Are you supposed to propose to me, or am I supposed to propose to you? And I could feel like, again, I was kind of going a little outside of being careful myself, but I had the feeling she's so careful, she needed me to not, to be a little uncareful. And so of course, we'll see what comes from all of that. But so I suppose that's the thing you're trying to feel like, is it that there's just some way you could leap in a little bit to what she might wish to be talking about? Or is there some deadness in her that you can't, like you can't meaningfully jump into something because it's something's, something else needs to be talked about? So
yeah, thank you. Yeah, that idea that the libidinal element can't depend on the patient alone, that there's something that has to come.
yeah,
That's
definitely.
really helpful. I appreciate it.
fine.
Lovely. Thank you, Mary Sacco. I think we can bring it to a close now. We have like 30 seconds or something, but before can we just, I think we should acknowledge Mary again and her contribution, and also all of you and the way you participated. This was a very lovely, lively evening. So thank you all so much.
So much.
I love
Yeah.
being with you.
Mary.
Thank you.
Thank
With
you.
all.
Thank
Very,
you.
very much.